Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 5 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I won a really spectacular game with black against Grandmaster Alexander Moisenko, and as I intimated at the end of that video, there were still 6 rounds to go even after that game, and the real challenge for me was going to be to try and block out a lot of the noise, a lot of the buzz around that game, and continue to play well, considering that there were so many more games to be played. And I was going to continue to face tough opponents. And in this one, I was actually paired up against another 2600 Grandmaster. This time, the name or the individual was Murali Karthikeyan, who's a really young, talented Grandmaster from India. Already at the age of 20 years old, he was already a 2-time national champion and just a super, super talented player. And so the road doesn't get any easier, let me put it that way. Now, I was white in this one, and I was hoping to kind of control the game a little bit and put myself in the best position to really do something would be to play kind of my controlled type of style. And that was what I tried to execute in this one. So I was white, and I opened with d4, and Murali played knight f6, and I went for knight f3, and then he played g6. And I'd actually looked at a bunch of his games the night before and had seen that he was mainly a King's Indian type of player, and I was trying to wrestle over which line I would choose, and I actually spent 4 or 5 hours agonizing over all these different main lines in the King's Indian. Actually, by the morning, I couldn't still get my head around any of the main lines. They were, devilishly complicated, and quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of good ways I found in my analysis to kind of get the controlled game I was looking for. So in the morning, it was kind of a snap decision that I'd actually return back to the old faithful, if you will, and play the London system. And so I actually played bishop f4 here and did not try to challenge him in the critical lines of the King's Indian, but instead play the London system. As you may know, the London system is very much more of a positional type of controlled game. You get your bishop outside the pawn chain and then tend to play e3 and c3 and just get a position. And it's something that I've used with reasonable success over the course of the year, whether it was in Grandmaster Chess Open when I beat Dmitry Collars in the last round of that one. I'm sure there are a few other games against decent players I've used it with some success this year. It's been something where you don't tend to get a significantly worse / losing position out of the opening. And I thought if I just got a position and was able to maybe get a grind in, that would be my best chance of winning. So anyways, after bishop f4, bishop g7 was played. And I played e3, and then castles, and bishop e2. This is standard fare in the London. And then after d6, this is like the first kind of critical decision you have to make, because theoretically, knight h5 is kind of a threat now to chase that bishop. Like if I go for castles, now knight h5, if bishop g3, you can just take my bishop and just get the bishop pair. And if I go to g5, then there's actually h6, and after bishop h4, g5, the knight will secure the bishop again if it goes back to g3. But the other trick here is that if white goes for knight d2 or knight e1, which are both playable moves, trying to take advantage of the fact the knight's unprotected, black actually has this move knight f4, which has, the opportunity to actually secure the light squared bishop. In a position like this, after e takes f4, g takes h4, you actually have a really complicated position on the board where black's king side is slightly spoiled, but he's going to have good counterplay in the center, playing on the dark squares, in particular against the white's lack of a dark square bishop. And sometimes this pawn on h4 can be somewhat of an asset, playing h3 to kind of weaken the white camp. So basically, the lines tend to get a little bit critical after d6, and the bishop can be hunted down. And so to kind of deal with that prophylactically, I play the move h3. And this is the most common move in this position, so that now white can drop back to h2 if needed. So anyways, after h3, black went b6, and this is kind of standard fare in the London for black. He's revving up for a c5 break. you might ask, why not c5 right away? Yeah, c5 right away is completely playable. I suppose that black could be a little bit wary of d takes c5, d takes c5, and queen takes d8. Perhaps he didn't want to play an endgame with the queens off the board. This does become a possibility. Black is totally fine here, I should say, but maybe that was something that he was, keen on, was keeping the queens on the board. So anyways, after b6, I castled, and then bishop b7 was played. Typically, black would love to fight for this e4 square. This is really a critical square in the position, and allows black some decent counterplay, so keep that in mind. After bishop b7, I now elected to play a4, and this is another really, really standard London move. The idea is to undermine the black queen side with a5. Black has a few ways to deal with this. One way is to ignore a5. I think that's the worst way. The other way is to play pawn a5, but I think that's a little bit double-edged and not necessarily the best for black. In fact, Christopher Yu, the young, talented international master from California, actually employed a5 against me earlier this year, and I wasn't super impressed because the light squares are a little bit too sensitive, in particular b5 after that thrust. And so the most normal move, most practical move is actually a6, and this is what Murali played. And a6 actually stops the a5 thrust, because now if I go a5, b5 is played, and this pawn on a5 is actually kind of a long-term target. So not something that you want to do is have this pawn fixed on a5. So after the move a6, normally the way to play is actually to go c3 now, and it's something that I've done before, is you establish this triangle of pawns, and you get this normal setup with knight bd2, rook e1, and so on. But in this position, I wanted to do something a little bit different, simply because I had basically gone for this setup before, and because of that, I actually wanted to play something a little bit more unique, and I went for the move c4. And c4 is actually extremely double-edged positionally, because this is not typically what you do. Typically, the reason you set up with this triangle of pawns on the dark squares is to limit the activity of black's dark squared bishop. By playing c4, what I actually do is I'm taking more space in the center, but the diagonal is kind of open if the d4 pawn is ever nudged. And so this is a very, very controversial idea. And in fact, in hindsight, I probably shouldn't go for this. And I probably won't go for this many more times, because I think it's a little bit imprecise to open up this diagonal. And we'll see why in a moment. After c4, black played knight bd7, just continuing to develop. And now I played knight c3, and my idea here was, okay, now that my pawn is on c4, my knight can actually come to the c3 square. Normally it's on d2, a little bit more passive, and here it actually influences more squares in the center. And in some lines, I can even consider shutting out the bishop with d5. But in this position, black was very, very alert and played a very precise move, and that's knight e4. And the point is you don't really allow me to take all of the space in the center, and you're challenging this knight on c3 right away, and potentially opening up the diagonal for the bishop on g7. So just a very, very dual purpose and effective move. And last but not least, with knight e4, you're also teasing the e5 break, potentially, because now there's enough support for it with the knight, the bishop, and the pawn all eyeing that square. So very, very good move. In this position, I actually took on e4. Another way I actually could have played is actually played a5. And this is something that maybe ought to have been considered, because there was some issue with my pawn on a4 sometimes being kind of fixed as a weakness. Because now that I have a4 and c4 as pawns kind of adjacent to each other, the b4 square actually becomes extremely weak. So I have to be very, very alert about my dark squares on the queen side, and a5 may have given me that opportunity to get rid of that weakness. Note that after knight takes c3, b takes c3, even though I have these double pawns, they actually do a good job, in particular the c3 pawn does a good job of shutting out the bishop on this diagonal, because even after, excuse me, even after a move like c5 is played, you can see here that the c pawn on c3 reinforces the center and ensures that the bishop won't have a direct line to a1. But that would have been another position. Instead, I played knight takes e4, which is the typical idea in these structures. When the knight comes to d4, you take on e4, and after bishop takes e4, you tend to try and play around this bishop on e4 or challenge the bishop. But again, what's really, really important here is this diagonal of the dark square bishop on g7, really having quite a bit of potential now that the pawn is no longer on c3. And that actually becomes the most important feature in the position. So I tried to play some London-esque moves, ignoring that feature was still a problem, and I went knight d2, which is a typical maneuver in the structure. Once you trade the knights on e4, sometimes you try to get rid of the light squared bishops, because there are some squares that are a little bit sensitive on black's queen side. But a better move than knight d2, or maybe at least I could say a reasonable alternative, would actually be the move a5. And again, the idea with a5 is to kind of liquidate the a pawn now that it's potentially a weakness that can be fixed on the dark squares. So just trying to activate my rook on the a file, get rid of that a pawn. And the point is, in these positions with my pawn on c4, b5 isn't really a possibility because I have two attackers on that square. So typically b5 would be the move you'd play after a5, but because I have the pawn on c4, it's not possible. So anyways, after bishop takes e4, I actually did go knight d2, and then the bishop, of course, darted back to b7, and I went for bishop f3. And this is kind of another London idea as you trade these bishops. Like I said, some of the light squares on the queen side are sensitive, and you get closer to like a kind of like an endgame type of structure. But the issue is that my structural integrity on this diagonal has been compromised. So the endgames that are typically fine for white are not as fine. And so instead of bishop f3, a move like bishop g3 or even bishop g5 would have been a little bit more sensible, darting out of the way of a potential e5 break. Instead, after bishop f3, black actually played a very, very good move, and one that I'd considered but had not taken as seriously until I'd actually gotten to this position. And the move was actually queen c8. And this is a really, really excellent move for a few reasons. First of all, you keep the tension on the diagonal, which is a good thing. Keeping the tension means that my knight doesn't actually get to the desired f3 square, where it's actually influencing the center, and this is a source of annoyance for me. The other point is that now the queen potentially can come to b7 and replace the bishop on that diagonal so that it actually still eyes the e4 square and has some control in the center. And then it also allows the black rook or the black rooks to be connected pretty much if the queen is able to, land on b7. And then last but not least, in some lines, the queen might actually support a c5 break. And the issue here again is that as long as this diagonal is nearly open, the bishop on g7 is something I'm going to have to contend with, and this wouldn't be a problem if my pawn was on c3. So basically, even though I managed to take a little bit more space with the c4 move, the issue is that the weaknesses behind and adjacent to c4, particularly this diagonal and the b4 square, are actually more significant, and that's why black is already a little bit better. So I realize this now after queen c8 that, I definitely was not better here, that I had some problems in the position, and I was just trying to not create more weaknesses given that this was the new reality that I was playing under. And so after queen c8, I actually played queen c2. And my idea here was to, cover the b2 pawn potentially, connect my rooks, and essentially prepare for the sturdy defense that I'd have to kind of, play under if I was going to, fight in this game, because the weaknesses were now going to come to bear in some sense if I, just played kind of lackadaisical. So after queen c2, bishop takes b7 was played, and I played, or excuse me, not bishop takes b7, bishop takes f3. And after knight takes f3, I do have some control over e5 now. But that's not the end of the story, because now black can play c5. And this is the point now, is that instead of playing e5 and giving the bishop potentially scope on this diagonal, because typically in Lenin structures of e5, the black bishop just peels back to g3 or even h2, and then the knight is frozen on d7 because e5 is hanging. And basically the c-pawn is discouraged from moving because the whole diagonal would be kind of sensitive. Instead, by playing c5, this bishop is still locked out on this diagonal because the structure is intact. And now you can see this bishop on g7 is entertaining, some real fight on that diagonal. So already here, I really need to be concerned about c takes d4 as a move on almost every turn. The other issue here is that now with c5, my b-pawn is kind of fixed as a weakness, a backward pawn, because b4 just hangs a pawn, so I can't really push that. And so basically, this pawn tension on c5 and d4 is positive pawn tension for black because he can elect to open the position whenever he wants. And it's negative pawn tension for me because if I take on c5, after b takes e5, you could see the b-pawn is going to be a target based upon the diagonal and the rook on b8. So, and again, I have really no targets here for my bishop. So basically, this is like a London system 101 as far as what not to do with white, because black's bishop is so much more potent than mine. So anyways, after c5, I actually elected to play bishop g5, acknowledging that opening that diagonal is probably a bad idea. And my idea here was to at least target the e7 pawn and tie a black piece down. So black went rook e8, which is a good move covering that pawn. And my idea here is at least the rook is tied down to e7. I've gotten out of the eye of fire potential e5 thrusts. And maybe I'd be provoking black into pushing my bishop around the horn and maybe get some squares, some light squares for my pieces. So anyways, after rook e8, this pawn tension is still extremely uncomfortable for me, and I have to contend with it, and I decided to play rook a3. And my idea here was, again, a little bit of prophylaxis to kind of, prepare myself for one of black's pawn breaks. Black is going to angle for c takes d4 or b5 at the right moment. And my thought process was, with rook a3, I'm getting my rook out of the diagonal of the bishop on g7. And in some circumstances, doubling rooks might be a good idea if b5 is played. So those were the kind of the ideas there. So I'm kind of waiting on black to kind of show me something while making some defensive preparations. You could argue for the move rook fd1, kind of reinforcing the d4 pawn and, basically holding the fort that way. But I was discouraged by the move rook b8. And I thought, again, the pressure on the b file would be something I would really have to contend with. And b5 becomes a move in a lot of positions, because after d takes c5, black can preserve the integrity of his pawn structure by capturing with the knight and keeping my bishop shut out and not having a good diagonal to work with. So, anyways, after rook a3, Murali went rook b8 anyway. Kind of funny, he's still preparing for b5. But at least here, I have the a file in the event that the b file opens. And so I thought this was kind of a small victory for me. After rook b8, I went rook c1. Again, kind of prophylactically, dealing with the impending b5 and or c takes d4 break. And also making sure my queen on c2 is protected, because there's some lines where b5 or c takes d4 is played, and my queen on c2 might be hanging and pinned with the c takes b5 not being possible. So rook c1, just make sure my pieces are protected. After rook c1 now, black played b5 and decided to go for it. And it is a good move, but you can actually argue that there's really no rush. Black could consider waiting a little bit more, maybe going rook b7 and queen b8 or queen b7. I think it would have been a little bit smarter, in my opinion, to be a little bit patient because I don't have any pawn breaks that are effective. Again, if I play a5, then b5 is on the cards. If I play d5, then the diagonal gets opened. And if I play e4, the d4 pawn is hanging. So in fact, it doesn't really seem clear to me what I can even do to improve my position. And I think black could afford to improve his position in a few ways. He might, protect e7 so that the rook is not tied down to it. He could consider connecting his rooks by moving the queen off the back rank. And all these things I think could be helpful to black's position. He can also consider doubling rooks on the b file. And so to me, I would have waited, but b5 is a good move. After b5, I played a takes b5 happily because at least my rook has some room on the a file now. And after a takes b5, I played b3, trying to hold up the c4 pawn a little bit more and at least exchange a few more pawns as opposed to kind of fixing my weakness on b2. Because if I play c takes b5, after rook takes b5, my b2 pawn is secured as a weakness and will be one for quite some time. Note that if d takes c5, black could just go for not rook takes c5. Well, rook takes c5 is actually also very effective, just securing a material because my rook on c1 would also be hanging. I'd actually lose an exchange here with rook c3, and then bishop takes c3 would be decisive. So yeah, so after c takes c5, rook takes c5, you could just see the weakness here is just too significant, and black could now press on the b file and win that pawn. So that's not really viable. It turns out here that instead of b3, though, rook a7 was actually a move, and evidently something that'd be a little bit stronger. The point is that actually after c takes d4, white actually is c takes b5. And in my opinion, this would be super, super difficult to see over the board. But the issue now for black rather, is that if the queens get exchanged, the knight's actually hanging. So black actually has to make a very important decision here. And after queen takes c2, rook takes c2, the material's actually level here, and the knight on d7 is actually hanging. Now, it's not so simple, because now black could throw in d3, basically forcing my rook off of the c file into a defensive posture. But after the move rook d2 and knight f6, after bishop takes f6, and knight e1, it's actually white that gets the knight to the d3 square, holds things together, and keeps the material balanced. Because after rook takes b5 and knight takes d3, white is effectively defending b2 and seems to have somewhat consolidated. Now, the issue here is that black is still better because all you have to do is just look at the pawn islands, and you can see black has one lovely pawn chain, and I have this weakness on b2. And also, the bishop is a little bit better than the knight, in my opinion, in this particular position. So, after a move like rook e b8, you can see that black can hammer away at the b2 pawn, maybe nudges king over to f8 to defend e7, and the defensive task here would still be, tricky for white, to say the least. But this would be a position where I've gotten to an endgame that's probably holdable with best play. Instead, I play this move b3, and unfortunately it allows black to liquidate really effectively under the right circumstances. Black played b takes c4, and note here, of course I don't want to play queen takes c4 because my b3 is fixed as a weakness, so I played b takes c4. And now actually there's a very, very particular line that would give black serious winning chances. And unfortunately for my opponent, he didn't see it, but the move is actually c takes d4. And the point is that if you go knight takes d4, the c pawn is just a permanent weakness. So the knight can come to c5 or maybe even e5. But either way, the knight comes into the game, the c pawn is blockaded, and then the rooks can sort of double on the b file. And ultimately, you could just play around the c pawn. That's a weakness. So that seems a little bit ill-advised. And after e takes d4, which does seem like the natural way to at least keep the pawns together and control some squares in the center, black actually is the amazing move bishop takes d4. And the issue for me is that after knight takes d4 and queen c5, just all of my pieces are hanging here. There's not a double attack, but a triple attack on my rook, knight, and bishop, and I can't cover them all at once. Now, I could, play some lines that make it a little bit tricky for black. For instance, one move that's kind of tricky is actually knight f5. And remarkably, g takes f5 is not a great idea because rook g3. And then I have, serious initiative against the black king. But the point is that after queen takes a3, I actually have knight takes e7 check, and at least I ruin black's pawn chain, and you can see without the dark squared bishop, some of the dark squares are actually weak. But after king g7, knight d5, and f6, my bishop is forced to move back, and I do have a knight on d5 that's quite active and a bishop on e3 that's fairly solid, but black is an exchange up, and that should be the most important feature in the position, so black would have quite serious winning chances here. The other way that I could try to contend with the bishop takes d4 idea and queen c5 is actually to play rook a7. And the point is that I at least attack the d7 knight so that, I try to, essentially remain up a piece after these exchanges. But note that the a7 rook is actually hanging there. And so the points after queen takes a7, knight c6, I actually get a rook back. But after queen c5, knight takes b8, and knight takes b8, black is actually a pawn up here, and after bishop e3, I'm trying to fight. I do have a decent minor piece, but black is a pawn up, and that should be the most important feature in this position, so black would be quite a bit better and have excellent winning chances. So essentially, c takes d4 and bishop takes d4 would be a really, really excellent tactic that just takes advantage of my unprotected pieces here, and kind of out of the blue, frankly. So it's understandable that my 2600 opponent didn't see it, but it would have been a huge opportunity. Instead, Murali erred, in my opinion, by playing the move rook b4, because this gives me an opportunity to kind of consolidate a little bit, and unfortunately, the idea is just a little bit too mechanical. Now, I can see the idea with rook b4 is that he's pressuring the c4 pawn a little bit more. He's entertaining knight b6 as a threat as well. But the issue here is that I can play the very simple rook a4. And the point is, by just challenging the rook on b4, it can't stay there. And this actually gives me a much-needed tempo to consolidate my position. Note that with the rook on a4, it's a lot better than it was on a3. First of all, it's on a light square, which is nice considering there's a dark square bishop, and if a bishop ever landed on b2, my rooks would have been skewered. But also, it's protected by my queen on c2. So this just means that I have one less piece that's unprotected. And last but not least, it also protects the c4 pawn. So all those features or factors are actually really, really good for me and kind of call into question this rook b4 move. Murali actually went back and played rook b7 after this move. And you could just see here I actually was able to gain some time because, really he could have played rook b7 right away if that was something that was what he wanted to do. And maybe this could have even been playable because, again, there's some ideas with doubling rooks and playing on the b file. And in some positions, the rook does a good job of actually covering e7 from protection from my bishop on g5. So, yeah, that would have been, a better try. But to go rook b4 and then go back to b7 is, kind of helped me out. So after rook a4, rook b7, I now went rook b1, trying to, liquidate the rooks here and basically ensure that black didn't dominate on the b file, because that was something that I was concerned about. And I thought exchanges here would help me with my defensive task, because I have, one weakness pretty much, the c4 pawn. And I thought by exchanging pieces, he didn't have as much to gang up on. So after rook b1, black played h6, challenging my bishop on g5. And I actually underestimated the strength of this move. I thought that h6 was always a little bit of a weakness because it weakened the pawn chain a little bit, particularly the g6 pawn. And it also potentially weakened some light squares if he actually played g5. But the nice thing about h6 is that it just causes my bishop a little bit of consternation because either square it goes to, it's going to potentially be harassed. So I actually elected to play bishop h4 to keep it on the diagonal, challenging e7. But actually, I kind of regretted that and wish I'd played bishop f4 because at least in these positions, my bishop is actually quite active if e5 ever gets played. Then I can actually retreat on this diagonal and be kind of active. Whereas on h4, it's actually not really hitting anything if the e-pawn moves. So I actually think it would have been a little bit better to retreat to f4, and we'll see why in a moment. Because after bishop h4, black actually played c takes d4, e takes d4, rook takes b1, queen takes b1, and then e5. And this whole line was really startling for me because I had thought, that exchanges would be helpful for me. But all of a sudden, after the last few exchanges and this e5 move, it really exploits my lack of coordination. Now this bishop on h4 is not really hitting anything, first of all. Second of all, e takes d4 is a threat. And also, my rook on a4 is very vulnerable to knight b6 or knight c5. Knight b6 is not possible now because it's hanging. But knight c5 is also a fantastic outpost for this knight once the d-pawn is moved from d4. So all of a sudden, I felt a lack of coordination, and it was very, very uncomfortable. Also, e4 becomes a threat, dislodging my knight from f3 and making way for bishop takes d4. And you could see here if my bishop was on f4, it would be just a little bit better because it would be basically eyeing the d6 pawn on that diagonal and just give me a little bit more counterplay. So in this moment, I thought that I was really lacking coordination and that this was probably going to be a lost position for me because it just seemed that everything was, crashing at the wrong moment. I played d takes c5 begrudgingly, but I thought I had to do it because e4 looked like too significant a threat. E takes d4 looked too problematic. It actually turns out here that I could play bishop g3, but I rejected this because after e takes d4, bishop takes d6, I thought knight c5 would be too powerful. I thought that the knight on c5 combined with the d-pawn being a factor would give black way too much counterplay. It actually turns out here I could actually take on c5, and after bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, queen b5 would hold because I'm hitting the e8 rook and the queen on c5, and more exchanges would actually kind of help me and secure a draw. But over the board, I really had my reservations about this line being playable. Of course, I also have to worry about e4 as a move, but it actually turns out here that the knight coming to d2 is actually, quite strong because from e4, it actually can come into the position quite nicely. So, turns out bishop g3 was better, but I captured on e5. After d takes c5 was played. And you can see here that my c-pawn is kind of more of a weakness than a strength right now. And black still has e4 as an idea kind of pushing me back. So, yeah, I did think still the position was quite critical. I went bishop g3 now, at least giving myself that diagonal to play with after e4 is potentially played. And I thought e4 would be the move that black would go for, but instead he went knight c5. And this makes some sense too, attacking the a4 rook, controlling some important squares. I actually was really worried about e4, but because I was thinking like e4, knight d2, and e3 would be very, very dangerous for me, just kind of weakening this whole diagonal, weakening my king side. But actually turns out after f takes e3, rook takes e3, and knight f1, I'm still remarkably holding on. My knight is protecting the bishop on g3. I'm challenging the rook on e3. I might go bishop f2, and I'm kind of holding on, but it does seem like it's a more pleasant position for black here, and I did think even with the limited material that black would be able to press. Instead, after knight c5, this actually was also quite critical because it seems like my rook is attacked, and I don't have many great scores to go to. Note that if I dart back to a1, then e4 is quite effective, hitting my rook on a1 and my knight on f3. And I'm really lacking that coordination still, but I thought it was important for me to be as active as possible because black did have threats with e4 and knight d3 and stuff. So I decided to play rook a7. And this was a move that I think Murali really underestimated because just for the moment with my rook on the 7th rank, I'm getting just enough counterplay for which e4 is kind of discouraged. Note that if e4 right away, I have rook c7 hitting the knight on c5, and so that's kind of important. And yeah, I mean, that's actually just a huge detail because after rook e4, rook c7, I mean, black could go queen a8 and still, try to trade these knights for each other. But the thing is that after rook takes c5, e takes f3, and rook b5, even though my pawn structure on the king side appears to be shattered after f takes g2, I have the move rook b8, forcing the exchange of all of the heavy pieces. And of course, this type of position with very, very simplified material and about to recover the pawn on g2 would just be a draw. So rook a7 is so important just because it entertains rook c7 as a move if the e-pawn is pushed. After rook a7, Murali went for queen e6, stepping the queen out of fire of rook c7 and also attacking the c4 pawn. So it seems like e4 is on the cards again. But here I actually played the very, very important move rook c7, and it's still very effective. The point is that with rook c7, I'm actually attacking the knight still, and if you get greedy and try to take the pawn on c4, this pin gives me a lot of counterplay, and yeah, it's just quite a decent position for me. I can entertain a move like queen b6, and try to hammer away at this pin. And yeah, black does not have enough to actually win the game after queen takes c4. And so because of that, after rook c7, black decided to move the knight and play knight a6. And now I went rook a7 again, challenging this knight on a6 and just trying to keep maximum activity. This was probably another good opportunity for black to try and make something of the position because I actually counted on the fact that losing the c4 pawn would give me ample counterplay. So I thought that after queen takes c4, I would kind of be fine here because I have queen b7 as a threat in some positions. I also thought that there might be some nuance with knight takes c5 and some tactics connected to that with queen b8 check if the rook was if the knight was dislodged. So, for instance, I thought that if I go here, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes, rook takes a6 becomes a resource because of queen b8 check, and of course this would basically simplify the position to a draw. So I thought that queen takes c4 was not super critical. But it turns out here that now with the rook on a7, e4 is actually quite playable. And the point is that after queen b5, which is actually kind of forced because if I go knight d2 now, e3 is decisive, in part because the knight on d2 is hanging, and there's also some issues where the a7 rook is hanging. I pretty much have to go queen b5. But after queen b5 now, this version of the knight trade is actually not as promising for me because rook d8 and rook d1 is a very legitimate mate threat. Now it turns out I can hold this game with rook d6, rook takes d6, bishop, queen b8 check, king h7, takes, and it appears that I am close to holding, but you can see in this position I do become a pawn down, and with my pawn split, this actually does become quite a difficult position to hold because I have a additional weakness to contend with, and black could try to play h5, h4, and cause some consternation to my bishop on this diagonal. So essentially, e4 in this particular circumstance would actually cause some huge problems to me, and quite frankly, even finding the move queen b5 in this position would be a tough find. I mean, it's not extremely obvious that I would need to make this move and actually allow e takes f3, and it's actually the only move to hold the game. So tough decision I would have had to make after e4. Instead, Murali went knight c5 back, and then I went rook c7, kind of implicitly offering a draw, because I'm obviously completely happy with the repetition here in a position where I'm defending. But instead, Murali, after knight a6, rook a7, we repeated one more time, and he went for e4 now. And this move was quite playable. Again, queen b5 is a move that I was looking at or the computer's looking at as a way to kind of hold the position here. I thought that type of ending would be very, very difficult, and quite frankly, I didn't see it during the game. And so actually, I went for the move knight e5, and this was the idea that I had with e4 being played, was that because the queen's actually tied to a6, I thought that I can put my knight on e5 and actually trade all the minor pieces if black so desired to win my knight on e5. And the other thing I liked about this is that I'm actually attacking the pawn on f7. So you can see that black's actually kind of has to trade the pieces here, because knight takes f7 is a legitimate threat. So after knight e5, bishop takes e5 was played, and I took with the bishop. And then after queen takes e5, I went rook takes a6. And you can see here that the material is level, but my lack of coordination here still gives black an advantage, because my queen and rook aren't protected, or they're not connected. The c pawn is isolated, and my king is a little bit naked right now. And these factors give black very, very reasonable chances. So there are basically two candidate moves in this position. One is the move that he played with queen c3, and the other one is e3. And e3 was the one that I'd calculated the most, because I thought that e3 is quite direct, and I'd have to capture on e3. But what I actually found is that e3 is probably just a draw, because after the e3, I'd recapture, and after queen takes e3 check, king h1, I do lose the pawn on c4 after a move like queen c3, because rook e1 check is a major threat, winning my queen and also, wrecking havoc on my king. But actually, after the move rook a1, I hold the back rank together, and I did not believe that a position after queen takes c4 is winning for black, because these rook endgames, 2 versus 3, on the same side are a draw, and so are the queen endgames, 2 versus 3 on the same side. So I thought that as long as I was able to hold the back rank effectively, even though my pieces are passive, this is quite holdable. And I could even start with a move like queen f1, and if queen d4, denying the trade of queens, I could even go rook d1, and essentially just challenge black into some type of exchange that would hold the game for me. So I didn't really believe this to be a position that black could win. Black could try. He can push the h-pawn a little bit, maybe fix my pawns as weaknesses. But the other issue is that in order to try and, press the position some more, he would weaken his own king. And that's why it's also very, very difficult to try and win this one. So I felt that this was within the drawing margin. And my opponent actually agreed, because he went for queen c3 instead and decided to hold off on the e3 push. I now recognize that e3 is also a legitimate threat, because now with the queen on c3, he's already entertaining some rook e1 ideas. And so I thought it was imperative to challenge the queen on c3 and not really worry about the c4 pawn. This pawn was going to be lost regardless, and trying to defend it would be a very vain exercise. So instead, I played the move queen a1. And the reason I did this is because I felt that by going to the endgame a pawn down, and and while trading a pair of heavy pieces, this would give me the best chances to hold. So after queen a1, queen takes c4 is played, but now I got to play rook a8 and force the trade of rooks off the board. And this greatly extinguishes the attacking chances that black has in this position. Now he has to grind away in an endgame. So after rook a8, rook takes a8 check was played, or rook takes a8 was played, and I play queen takes a8 check. And after king h7, he steps away from the checks and is able to hold f7. And he's trying to kind of get the grind here and press me a pawn up in the queen endgame. So the question is, how do I hold this one? What do I have to look out for? What do I have to, be wary of? How do I defend this position? Well, I didn't know, I didn't have all the answers here, but I basically thought there were some basic guidelines I need to abide by. First of all, I really did not want to allow e3. So I thought it was very important for my queen to kind of hold the e3 square in a lot of lines, just so that he didn't open up this diagonal and take advantage of my king there. The other thing I wanted to watch out for is the advance of his pawns, because I thought once his pawns get advanced, my queen would be able to swoop in and probably give perpetual check. So my thought process was secure the e3 break, but also keep my queen close enough to the black king where I can deliver checks if black starts to push his pawns and try to press the advantage. And last but not least, I didn't want to create any more weaknesses in my camp. I think it's very, very tempting to try and push your pawns here. Probably play g3 and h4. I have mentioned this pawn setup as being a really good defensive setup in rook endgames because if you have your pawns on h4, g3, and f2, black can't create any additional... black can't actually split your pawns up because every exchange will actually keep your pawns connected, so there wouldn't be any weaknesses if you set up f2, g3, and h4. But in this particular position, I felt that with the queens on the board, putting the pawn on g3 would probably be more to my detriment, because I thought if the queen ever landed on f3, e3 would be a really important threat, which breaks up my pawns and weakens my g3 pawn. So in this particular version of the position, I thought, don't create any more weaknesses than you already have. Defend without creating weaknesses, because that would be the key. And I guess maybe the last point that, is very important, of course, is not to trade queens, because the 4 versus 3 pawn endgame would just be a win. The black king could march to e5, and then he can make a passed pawn on the e file, and that would be decisive. So I definitely don't want to trade queens because the king pawn endgame is losing, and my best chance here is to get some type of perpetual check. All right, so I started with the move queen a7. And the idea here is that it controls e3 and also pins the f7 pawn, so he can't actually push his pawns forward. Murali went queen c1 check, and I went king h2, but note even here I'm still holding on to e3. And then after queen f4 check, I went king g1. Again, not keen on playing g3 because then the queen could come into f3 and is actually quite snug there. It would be a huge problem for me. f2 would be a target. It just wouldn't be desirable. So I went back to g1, and now g5 was played. And you can see this is what he has to try to do to win, is he has to try to advance his g, f, or h pawns because my queen is holding the e3 square. And it's very, very tempting, again, to try and push the g-pawn and fix these pawns here. But I thought, do not create any more weaknesses than you already have. So I went queen c5, just trying to hold this diagonal, hold the e3 break. And black now went queen f6. And now I went queen a7, still holding the diagonal. Queen e6, queen b7 now. Here I actually decided that e3 was something I could tolerate because I actually realized that if e3 here, after I capture, I can actually keep my king on h1. And here there'd be no way to trade queens with the queen on b7 and the king on h1. As long as my king is on h1 and my queen is on a light square, and I didn't allow some exchanges with queen f4 check, it's actually kind of impossible for him to break through my defenses without pushing his h and g pawns even further. And that would give me very valuable perpetual check chances. So I actually thought, you know what, I can allow e3, and that's why I went queen b7. After queen b7, black played h5, and I went queen a7 back. And then h4 is played, and you can see now he's fixed my g2 pawn here, and it is a fixed weakness, because if I push the g pawn, h3 is hanging, there might be some hg3, fg3, and then the e3 pawn is passed, and so I am getting boxed in. But the point is, it's not enough to win, and so I just need to hold firm and be a little bit patient. So after h4, I went queen c5, still holding this diagonal. And black played king g6, defending the pawn. And I went queen e3, just still holding. And after queen c6, I went queen a3, holding the e3 square still, and also holding queen c1 check. After queen e6, I went queen c5. I thought this was nice because I'm actually boxing the queen out of important squares and still holding the diagonal. And now black finally went f5. So, okay, so now I have to be a little bit more alert because f4, e3 is an idea to try and get a passed pawn. So I have to be very, very careful here. And because now the position had changed, he's trying to actually go for it, and I can't just keep the same stance that I was keeping before. And so here I actually went queen d4. And the idea with queen d4 is I'm creeping a little bit closer to the black king, controlling some of the squares near the black queen, and waiting on f4 as a move. f4 was now played, and now I went king f1. And this was my idea now, is that if e3 is played, I actually need to get my king close enough that I can actually capture that pawn. So queen c6 was played, but if e3 is played, I actually now am comfortable with potential queen exchanges because my king can actually corral the e3 pawn, and this would be a draw. Note that if my king decided to stay away, if I played a move like king h1, now e3 becomes a problem because e2 and e1 is just decisive, and my king is not close enough to blockade the pawn. So very, very important that my king comes close to the pawn, I thought, when e3 becomes a threat. So after king f1, black played queen c6. And now my king is kind of under fire because queen c1 check becomes a threat. But I thought also that now that the queen is not actually protecting the e3 square, I thought that I can actually run away. So I actually started with queen e5 to try and get my queen in front of or behind the pawn and also stop the black queen from getting in front of the pawn. And I evaluated that after queen c1 check and king e2, there wasn't anything potent here. My king could just step back and forth between e1 and e2, and now my queen was in prime position to give some perpetual check. So after queen e5, black went queen c4 check, and now I actually went king g1. And the reason for that is now that my queen is on e5, e3 isn't really a threat yet because the queen is not protecting the e3 square. And in addition to that, my queen is actually so close to the black king that perpetual checks start to become a thing. Note that if a move like e3 is played, I could take it. And then if queen c1 check, I can just go king f2. And again, I'm covering e3 and there's no problems here. After king g1, black went queen c6, defending the pawn again. But you can see here that now my queen is sufficiently encroached into the black position, and black's pawns are advanced far enough where perpetual checks start to creep in. And with the queen on c6, e3 again is not a threat. So now I actually just went king h2, stepping into the corner because I realized that there's no real decent way for black to improve the position here. And I thought that by just shuffling my king back and forth, I'm pretty much secure. Black now went f3, trying to kind of, break this way and still guard against the perpetual checks in the position. So guarding some of these squares. But f3 is not the break that's going to give you a passed pawn because now e3 is never going to happen. And I could take on f3, but I thought this position would be a little bit risky because now, again, if the queens come off the board, I think I'm probably losing. And I didn't like the fact that queen f4 check might be an idea at some point. So instead, I actually decided to play g4 here. And I thought this move was really, really effective. Because with g4, I'm actually threatening queen f5 check. And the king is actually a little bit boxed in with this g4 move. And then the other issue is that if h takes g3 is played, now I can go king takes g3, and my king can actually step up and threaten the g5 pawn. And you can see from in this particular version, e3 is just not a break that's going to be harmful to me because I'm overprotecting that square. And even my king might get on the act, and if the queen's not on this diagonal, I might actually be able to take on f3. So I thought that g4 really secured me the draw because now the queen has to remain close to the king to basically stop the perpetuals. After g4, black actually played king f7, and this is almost like a implicit draw offer because he's actually hanging g5, which is probably not advisable. I went queen takes g5. I just had to double check that I wasn't getting mated, but it turns out that there's no mate. And after queen d6 check, he actually offered a draw because now if my king steps back, let's say to g1, after queen d1 check, king h2, there's no mate. And the only way he could try to press the position is actually queen f1, trying to deliver mate. But now I can deliver 1,000,001 checks. And after queen f5 check, if the king steps to the e file, I can take on e4 and then on f3. And so that's not advisable. And so you pretty much have to go back to the g file. And then here I can just repeat. So after the move queen d6 check, we actually agreed to a draw. Really, really tough game, I must say, and one I was quite happy to hold. Again, this is a Indian national champion, 2600 player, and actually quite early on, I was kind of forced to essentially establish a defensive posture that was very, very difficult to contend with. Essentially, for like 40 moves, I was really having to defend, and that's really tough against a strong player. But I did it, and it's really nice not to lose a game where you're defending for a long time. That being said, I did not put the pressure on with white that I wanted to, and it was a little bit disappointing that was the case. But I think a very, very important lesson was learned here that c4, playing c4 in the London system, particularly when black has fianchettoed his bishop, is kind of ill-advised because the diagonal, the h8 to a1 diagonal really opens up, and c5 becomes an excellent idea for black. And so a very, very important lesson for me in that respect. Anyways, a draw does not hurt me, and being now on 4.5 out of 5, I was close to the leaders in the event, so I knew I'd still have some tough opponents ahead. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.